Difference in Repetition was first published in France in 1968 as part of Deleuze's PhD, the other part of which was dedicated to Spinoza. These two works represent the culmination of what we could call Deleuze's first period, which focuses exclusively on important philosophical and literary figures. With Difference in Repetition, however, this pattern is broken, something new and important is happening. And indeed, in the preface to the English edition, Deleuze says this: "After I had studied Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche and Proust, all of whom fired me with enthusiasm, Difference in Repetition was the first book in which I tried to do philosophy. All that I have done since is connected to this book, including what I wrote with Guattari." What was Deleuze concerned with when he wrote Difference and Repetition? This is obviously a complex question, but in the dialogues, he gives us the following clue. "I believe that what concerned me in many cases was to describe this exercise of thought, whether in a writer or for itself, insofar as it is opposed to the traditional image which philosophy has projected, has erected in thought in order to subjugate it and prevent it from functioning. So in the most general sense, Difference and Repetition is about liberating thought. It is not a moral system aimed at telling us how to behave, but rather it is an ethics which aims at making thought faster. The fact that ethics is intrinsically linked to speed is an idea borrowed from Spinoza. Spinoza's ethics, Deleuze explains, has nothing to do with the morality. He conceives it as an ethology, that is, as a composition of fast and slow speeds, of capacities for affecting and being affected. This ethical program could therefore be called the first axis of the book. It is bound to influence another axis, which is the theory of knowledge, so-called epistemology. What can we say about the epistemology of Difference and Repetition? Let us consider a second quote from the dialogues. "I liked writers who seemed to be part of the history of philosophy but who escaped from it in one respect, or altogether. Lucretius, Spinoza, Hume, Nietzsche, Bergson. Of course, every history of philosophy has its chapter on empiricism. Locke and Berkeley have their place there. But in Hume there is something very strange which completely displaces empiricism, giving it a new power, a theory and practice of relations, of the and, which was to be pursued by Russell and Whitehead, but which remains underground or marginal in relation to the great classifications, even when they inspire a new conception of logic and epistemology. So the theory and practice of the and, the theory of relations, will become part of Deleuze's method, so-called Transcendental empiricism. It focuses on creation rather than description, on learning rather than knowing. Learning, Deleuze explains, is the appropriate name for the subjective acts carried when one is confronted with the objectivity of a problem, which he calls the idea with a capital I, whereas knowledge designates only the generality of concepts or the calm possession of a rule enabling solutions. Finally, a third axis in which Difference and Repetition introduces a notable change is ontology, which is the study of being in the largest possible sense. Here Deleuze argues that being is not analog as in Plato's model of essences, in which appearances are said to be analog to their essence, which is why they are what they are. Rather, being is said to be univocal. As Deleuze says, there has only ever been one ontology, that of Duns Scotus, which gave being a single voice, that is, a univocity. So generally speaking, Difference and Repetition follows three main axes, only to reverse them. In morality, where the moral prescription of behavior is replaced with ethics as the art of organizing encounters. In epistemology, in which the classical subordination of learning to knowledge is reversed. In ontology, where univocity replaces analogy. All of these topics we will discuss in due course, but there is a deeper change that I want to talk about, which is not primarily conceptual, and which concerns the nature of thought itself. I think it's important to mention it in this first approach to Difference and Repetition. If you read Difference and Repetition, you might be struck by certain stylistic and formal choices that are found in the text. For example, Deleuze's invitation in the preface to begin our reading with the conclusion, or the reversal of the names of the first and final chapters, or also the figure of the entire metabole, which we have seen in the last video. Examples like this abound, and they express the fundamental problem of representation, which gives us an upside-down image of what we do. This is, of course, a grave concern, and in the introduction to Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says this: "Modern thought is born of the failure of representation, of the loss of identities, and of the discovery of all the forces that act under the representation of the identical. The modern world is one of simulacra. Man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. All identities are only simulated, produced as an optical effect by the more profound game of Difference and Repetition." What is the problem with representation? Why does it fail? Representation fails because it subordinates what we do to an abstract idea of what there is. Empiricism is subordinated to metaphysics, in a certain sense. To put it very simply, the classical representative framework inaugurated by Plato states that we should explain the particular after the abstract. So for example, this particular cat is what it is by virtue of its abstract essence. Its essence is the cause for its behavior, and for the fact that I can recognize it as a cat. But the problem with this model is that instead of explaining what a thing is, it postulates a higher ideal version of this being and explains away its image, its concrete manifestations, as a degradation of the ideal image. This is how change and difference are explained away by Plato. But the problem with this view is that it postulates what it really tries to explain, and that's a contradiction. As opposed to this, and following Nietzsche, Deleuze argues that we should do the opposite and explain the abstract after the concrete. And this Deleuze will achieve with the eternal return. So he says, the repetition in the eternal return is the same, but the same insofar as it is said uniquely of difference and of the different. This is a complete reversal of the world of representation and of the sense that identical and similar had in that world. This reversal is not merely speculative but eminently practical, since it defines the conditions of legitimate use of the words identical and similar by linking them exclusively to simulacra, while denouncing the ordinary usage made from the point of view of representation. So you might wonder, isn't the eternal return itself a concept, meaning a representation? And if so, how can it help us undo representation? Deleuze, of course, is very aware of this. Here's how he solves the problem. Eternal return is not of faith, but the truth of faith. It has isolated the double, or the simulacrum. It has liberated the comic in order to make this an element of the superhuman. That is why it is not a doctrine, but the simulacrum of every doctrine, the highest irony. It is not a belief, but the parody of every belief, the highest humor. A belief and a doctrine eternally yet to come. This sheds a light on one of the deeper intentions of difference and repetition. Like Nietzsche before him, Deleuze speaks as a doctor of civilization, and his comments on representation are really diagnostics. Representation as modeled by Plato has failed, he explains, and so we have lost the ability to form and represent identity. Far from encouraging relativism, skepticism, or solipsism, all of which are based on representation and breed indifference. Difference and repetition is a call to arms against the failure of representation. The solution raised by Deleuze against indifference will be difference. To implement a philosophy of difference implies a critique of representation which will reverse the order between what we do and what there is, between the empirical and ideal aspects of experience. This in turn will affect both the theory and practice of philosophy. And so Deleuze will spend many pages on a new form of empiricism called Transcendental empiricism, which will achieve all this. Transcendental empiricism is a very complex notion, but there are three aspects that I want to discuss because I think they are important to understand the general framework of difference and repetition. How does transcendental empiricism differ from normal empiricism, and what can it bring to us? As Deleuze explains elsewhere, transcendental for Kant qualifies the principle of necessary subjection of what is given in experience to our a priori representations, and correlatively, the principle of a necessary application of a priori representations to experience. So experience is said to be transcendental when it is conditioned by space and time. However, Deleuze says that fundamentally the here and now of experience is not in the ordering of sense data according to pre-established representations, but on the contrary, it is in the here and now of a presentation, an encounter with a sign that forms a becoming. This is why he says that empiricism is both mystical and mathematical. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, nor a simple appeal to lived experience. On the contrary, it undertakes the most insane creation of concepts ever seen or heard. Empiricism is a mysticism and a mathematicism of concepts, but precisely one which treats the concept as object of an encounter, as here and now, or rather as an eerie one from which emerge inexhaustibly ever new differently distributed heres and nows. Interestingly, Deleuze chooses Butler's term eerie one because it is an anagram of both nowhere and now here. So the idea with a capital I, which is the objectivity of a problem, is the eerie one. The foundation of the mystical encounter with a sign which appears out of nowhere is now here, and as such produces a somewhere of experience, a territory if you like. So you see, concepts in this understanding are not primarily means of recognition, they are, rather, products of a creation. And it is this creation that is the object of our knowledge, first and foremost. The second point I want to make regards the harmony of the faculties. It has often been argued in philosophy that in order to have an adequate idea of an object, our faculties must somehow be in accord with each other. Deleuze argues that this is the case for rationalism, empiricism, and implicitly for Kant's transcendental idealism, and as against this, he argues that thought in the largest sense is not about harmony, but it's about a certain form of valence. Thought is primarily trespass and valence, the enemy, and nothing presupposes philosophy. This implies two things. First, that the transcendental is not about explanation, rediscovering a pre-established harmony, for example, but in conformity with an immanent critique. It must be found in the exercise of the faculties themselves, in their self-overtaking, so to speak, meaning the way they transcend themselves. Secondly, thought as a form of valence implies that we don't speak because we want to, but because we have to, in relation to a specific problem. Thought should find within itself something which it cannot think, something which is both unthinkable and that which must be thought. So each faculty, sensitivity, imagination, memory and thought, will communicate with every other faculty by means of a valence in which it transcends itself, such that it will communicate its own particular unthinkable. When sensibility transmits its constraint to the imagination, when the imagination in turn is raised to the level of transcendent exercise, it is the phantasm, the disparity within the phantasm, which constitutes the fantastion, which is both that which can only be imagined and the empirically unimaginable. With regard to memory, it is not similitude in the reminiscence, but on the contrary, the dissimilar in a pure form of time, which constitutes the immemorial of a transcendent memory. The common denominator of all the faculties is the intensity, which we usually represent as a difference between two values, but which, in fact, is really this valence that takes place, this unthinkable of each faculty, this difference or multiplicity which kicks through the door of every other faculty. What can we know with transcendental empiricism? Deleuze criticizes the so-called hypothetic apodictic form of knowledge, which designates the form of knowledge that proceeds from a possible hypothesis to a necessary conclusion. It is, in essence, the scientific method, and it originates in Plato. Already with Plato, the dialectic was defined in this manner. Depart from hypotheses, use hypotheses as springboards or problems in order to attain the anhypothetical principle which determines the solution to the problems as well as the truth of the hypotheses. That is, the point of departure found in a hypothesis or proposition of consciousness affected by a coefficient of uncertainty, as with Cartesian doubt, and the point of arrival found in an eminently moral apodicticity or imperative, of which there are many examples in philosophy. The problem with this method is that it cannot seize the real movement of thought. So Deleuze says, while this procedure maximally approximates the real movement of thought, it also maximally betrays and distorts this movement. As far as philosophy is concerned, Deleuze condemns this form of scientism, which is the reduction of all modes of thinking to the scientific mode of thinking. And he praises Kierkegaard and Nietzsche for being the first thinkers who really put metaphysics in movement, as he says. Ultimately, in philosophy, Deleuze says, the movement goes not from the hypothetical to the apodictic, but from the problematical to the question. Of course, Deleuze does not criticize science as such, which would make no sense, but rather the overgeneralization of its method in the human sciences. Neither does he advocate for indifference towards life, quite the contrary. Difference in Repetition is a highly technical book, and here we have barely scratched the surface. We will encounter all these themes again, and many others, in future videos. But for now, let's conclude with this quote from the Dialogues, which I think aptly describes what difference in repetition is and does. These thinkers, Lucretius, Spinoza, Hume, Nietzsche and Bergson, have few relationships with each other, apart from Nietzsche and Spinoza, and yet they do have them. One might say that something happens between them, at different speeds and with different intensities, which is not in one or other, but truly in an ideal space, which is no longer a part of history, still less a dialogue among the dead, but an interstellar conversation between very irregular stars, whose different becomings form a mobile block, which it would be a case of capturing, an interflight, light years. In the next video, we will begin the formal study of the book. For now, thank you for watching and see you soon.